talk about how you went in, really how your film work started, and you had a pretty amazing trifecta in a short period of time of Tron, Blade Runner,
I'm
and
lucky.
Aliens, which is a pretty remarkable amount of work in a short period of time. How did the film work begin for you?
Well, the U.S. Steelbooks went horizontal. That was the first big visibility boost. That actually started my career because a career depends on referrals and a visibility that generates demand for having you do something for somebody and get paid for it. So John Dykstra and his partner Bob Shepard had a company called Apogee. They were assigned by Robert Wise, the director, to do post-production for Star Trek The Motion Picture, the first of the Star Trek series. And I got a phone call. Just moved out here in 75, so this is now 78. Get a phone call from Bob Shepard, and would you like to meet for lunch and work on a science fiction film? And I thought, well, that's nice. You know, I had no particular ambition to be in the film industry at all. I'd been doing corporate design work for 20 years before that. So I had lunch with him at the Century Plaza Hotel and started doing the designs for V'ger at the end of the climax of the film. Met Robert Wise. Interestingly, Katzenberg was guarantee producer with Paramount at the time. And I also had the Phillips account. So I'm in a meeting. This is just a little side story. I'm in a meeting, and Robert Wise said, Mead, he said, I'd like maybe one more generation of sketches for this V'ger thing. And I said, well, Mr. Wise, I'm leaving for Eindhoven in 2 days from now. Without a pause, he turns to Katzenberg and he says, do we have a studio in Amsterdam, an office? Yes, sir. I have a driver go down to Eindhoven every second day and pick up Mead's sketches, and we'll courier them back here. So my first movie was done halfway around the world in Holland, about half of the design for V'ger. So Star Trek comes out, and then Ridley has gotten together. Michael Dealey had just come off producing the Deer Hunter, Deer Slayer. Was it Deer Slayer?
I think it was Deer Hunter, wasn't it?
I guess it was Deer Hunter.
Yeah, with Robert De Niro, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So he'd just done that, and he and Ridley had gotten together, and they had financing pieced together with Bud Jorkin and Jerry Parenchio, Sir Run Run Shaw in Hong Kong. Some wag in New York said the financing of Blade Runner was at least as interesting as the story. So I have a meeting with them at the 9000 building on Sunset, which was the Playboy building, and started working on Blade Runner. And my lawyer started doing the contract with the film company. So that was the first one. So I just sort of fell into all this. And I was doing other work at the same time, architectural renderings and design work for clients around the world. And so Blade Runner comes out to less than tumultuous acclaim. Very disappointing. Mm-hmm. And then Tron. I was actually doing post-production work on Blade Runner, Blade Runner, some of the matte shots. And then I get a call from Don Kushner, who was working with Steve Lisberger at Disney to produce Tron. And Disney was going through a very bad period at that time. They're ready to be bought out like Krikorian did to MGM for the library and sold off in different corporate sections. And Tom Wilhite was feature executive at that time. That wasn't his real job, but he had just taken over the position. And so Lisberger comes from Boston, had some stuff already done which he didn't like. And so I got involved in doing Tron, and I'd come up from my house in Capistrano Beach to do Blade Runner in the morning, have lunch at Denny's, and then drive over the hill to Burbank and have an afternoon meeting with Tron. Then I'd go home. So I was working with Tron and Blade Runner essentially at the same time. So people who say, well, I have a dystopian view of the futures, that's really silly because you can't imagine two more different films than Tron and Blade Runner. Then Cameron gets the nod, the green light to do Aliens. I was in Florida as one of the judges for that year's Miss Universe contest. I know this sounds just bizarre. And segue. So he knows about me now. And he FedExes the script down to me. I read the script. I start drawing the Sulaco on the way back on the plane. and we changed that. And then 2010 comes along at MGM with Peter Hyams, and I met Arthur C. Clarke. He was in some cameo shots, remember, in front of the White House, and so I met him. And so that was my movie career, starting, as you say, very, very fast. I mean, four high-profile films in a very short number of years.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I am going to ask a few slightly off-topic Blade Runner questions, but I have to. And it does relate, because I think the fascinating thing about Blade Runner was the Asian aesthetic that was brought into the cityscape, and that's obviously seemed like a very clear design element, an intentional design element. And I'm wondering if you could talk about where that came from, if that was sort of a combination of your influence and Ridley, or it was just...
No, I did one, these little gouache sketches that I did were only about this big. They're very, very small, really. People want us to exhibit them, and I say, well, they're only like 15 by what? I say, oh, that's not very big for an exhibit, you know. So, but there's a scene where we have the armadillo or Sebastian's truck parked there, and it was going to be in what was going to be the Chinatown part of the Blade Runner set. It was never fleshed out to that degree. But I just did, you know, happenstance kanji, you know, scribbles. I have no idea what it says. Ridley, of course, did hire a linguist to make sure the signs. The reason Ridley did that is because then you could make the visual clutter very dense with this Asian cultural influence, but the American audience couldn't read it. So it packed up the visual density of the shot, but it didn't you know, mean anything particularly. Now, I don't know whether it actually said things. So, of course, Blade Runner is extremely popular in Japan. But the sensibility of the lighting, all that, Ridley had been to, knew about the Japanese culture quite well, because he did Black Rain after this particular movie. When I was in Japan in '61, there wasn't even a small bit of the elaborate electronic signage in Ginza, for instance. It was, you know, it hadn't gotten to that density point yet.
And you came up with an interesting concept, which I'm probably misremembering, but I think you called it retro engineering.
Retro deco.
Retro deco, yes. Thank you. Where you would, like, buildings would have to kind of remain standing.
Everything.
You would have to attach things to the outside.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Could you talk about that a little? Because that's such a fascinating idea.
They were using Warner Brothers' back lot. It was all shot on lot, except for the Bradbury building. And Ridley wanted to make... These backlot streets have been shown in hundreds and hundreds of films and westerns, and he wanted it to be disguised so you would never recognize any of these facades. So part of working with Larry Paul, the production designer of record, I just visually packed this stuff onto these facades and to make them unrecognizable. That was part of it. And part of it was the socioeconomic profile of the story. Everything really important was happening off-world, the off-world colonies and all that. So what was left here was sort of, it had to be made to work regardless. And I used the models of retro, backward, mechanical cultural icons like Cuba, the Philippines, where they have the jitneys. They take something, a vehicle, whatever it happens to be, and you just make it work way past its demise, its design deadline. And that sort of drove that look. And then I took architecture, everything I could imagine, Byzantine and Neo-Greco, and all these different styles, and just mashed them all together, and then added this curious electronic overlay for signage and stuff. And what you end up with is a look that looks completely logical, but it's complete mechanical fantasy.
The interesting thing about it, I think, and why it endures, and why all the films that have copied it, I think, have failed, is I think that film really exemplifies design with an idea behind it. Even though it was a lot of detail, it seemed to make sense and to have been thought out. And I think what has happened is people trying to copy that film just throw details on top of things,
which doesn't work.
And
No.
this is kind of why I want you to talk about, like, what's the balance between idea and detail in art?
Well, you have to be there in your head. You have to be on that street, imagining what you'd put on that building to carry power from here, and you'd have this generator sitting at the curb, because the street now became the basement for this city, which had now gone up, very high. I think I imagined in Blade Runner land, the big buildings were probably 200, 300 stories. I don't remember how high Deckard's elevator went on the readout, but it went above 100. And I, in my mind, I was thinking, how would you put together a society that depends on this patchwork put together? And that means you'd have cabling running up over buildings. And I'd been to Europe by that time, and the practice in Europe, some of these old castles and things, when they air condition them or replumb them, they just run stuff outside these walls that are 1 meter thick or more. And so all these sensibilities come together, and you produce something that looks completely believable, because you really have thought why that cabling system should be there rather than over there. Some of it's composition and the nicety of the look, but really it's very, very deliberate. It's not done happenstance, and people that copy that style, that don't think that way, it comes off looking like something's wrong. I worked with Westwood Studios in Las Vegas a couple of years after, they got licensed from Warner Brothers to use the basis of Blade Runner as a game. It didn't go anywhere, but the premise was that you were following Deckard 15 minutes after the film time, the scene film time. And I was hired as a consultant to help their designers reprogram their thinking patterns so they could duplicate the look, but in a slightly different stylistic way. And I found out what they were doing was just adding detail, thinking they could duplicate it, and it didn't work. The flying Deckard's car was essentially industrial design in reverse. I thought, we have flying cars, because the spinner was called that in the script, the original story. And so I thought, they have flying cars, so rich people have flying cars. Nice, sleek limos, aerial limos. And I thought, what happens when that kind of a vehicle is decommissioned, like you do for an airplane, for instance? And I thought, okay, now it's a street vehicle. You strip off some of the sheet metal that was laminar flow control and external flaps and things. Take that off. You have to add street packaging for driving, turn signals, headlights, and things like that. And what you end up with is Deckard's vehicle, and it's been taken apart, but very, very carefully, and added onto very carefully. So it looks completely logical, but it has this odd, junky look to it.
Yeah, and it really resonated, as you say, in Japan. Just the whole aesthetic, and in a sense, I think. Do you think it's fair to say Blade Runner kind of gave you an audience in Japan you didn't have before? Or?
Oh, I think so, definitely, yes.
And why do you think, if just stepping back from it, it was so impactful for you with a Japanese audience, specifically Blade Runner, and the aesthetics you brought to it?
Now, I may be wrong, but in my understanding of the Japanese mentality relative to fantasy, fantasy is just considered something that's not real. It's a rather, I think, simplistic transfer over to a story format. And Blade Runner is completely immersive. It is its own world. It's consistent. It never violates its own story idea. The most irritating thing in a movie to me is you have superhero yada yada yada, and suddenly he's incapacitated because he saw his reflection in I don't know. But they violate the character's capacities for the convenience of that particular time in the story, which I think is dumb. It happens with Superman. It happens with all these superhero characters. And I think it's sort of dumb. Blade Runner never violates its own premise, which is very important. It's very consistent. And the storytelling art of it is seamless. It really holds together.
There's also a theme in Blade Runner which I think relates, and in my personal opinion, the anime kind of world picked up on and responded to, which is the whole man-machine, relationship. And obviously that's a huge thing in Japan.
We're in Japan. We're there already. There are robots being built in Japan by all these electronic companies that are they talk, they interact. The first Asimo had to have a big backpack because computers weren't that fast. Now computers are condensed. They're very fast. You can have multiple terabytes in a little handheld package, and that means you can build a robot that's athletic, that's slim, doesn't have the backpack, and it's instantly programmable, and it does acrobats. It stands on one foot, can run. The first running robot was about this high, and it can run with both feet off the ground. So it's calculating the weight of the body, the forward thrust, when the next foot comes down, and transfers the weight to that foot while the other foot is brought forward for the next step, and it runs. And that's amazing. It's autonomous, completely autonomous. I was working on Short Circuit. PSO Productions sent me to Japan, to Tsukubo, which is north of Japan, the industrial kind of technical city, to see an exhibit on robots. And at that time, they had a robot walking back and forth, but it had this big cabinet on top with loose cables going up to the power source and to the computing source. But it would walk back and forth and back and forth. And we've come a long, long way. Now you have skin, you have the motion points underneath that skin. The robot talks, it can dance, it can play the violin, it's amazing. So we'll have robot companions with much sooner than people think. The genius of Blade Runner, in terms of convincing people that the story was rational, was using live actors and making the public believe they were artificially created. That was a big breakthrough. They weren't, like Batty says, we're not machines, Sebastian, we're flesh and blood. And when you think about it, if you were up against two choices, two branches, it would be easier to make another human because they're relatively easy to make, and you'd boost the genetic profile at birth or in the cell structure, and then come up with a superhuman, rather than building a machine that tries to duplicate the whole thing.
Right.
So that was the premise for Tyrell, and what was his slogan? More human than human. That's our design goal. And even Lawrence Paul did an interview, and the interviewer said, was Deckard a replicant? And I thought, well, of course he was. And Lawrence Paul said, I don't really know that still, if he was. And I thought, oh, for Christ's sakes, Paul, you have the little unicorn, you have the memory flash. Of course he's a replicant, but he was beyond Rachel. He was beyond Nexus 6. That was the next. And Tyrell wanted to see if Deckard, as that generation of replicant, could recognize that Rachel was a replicant, which is the next tier down, but still above Nexus 6.
Yeah, it kind of.
That's why Deckard was so good at what he did, because he was a replicant, and he could key in and sort of resonate with how replicants worked.
Yeah, that was the fascinating thing. It was sort of the mystery, and it was never really answered, so it was a left. But I
and even Ridley said, of course he's a replicant,
So before I dive into your anime work, I have to leave Blade Runner with the final question, because last week there was a lot of buzz because Ridley announced he was going to do a new movie maybe, and obviously I'm not looking for scoops here because who knows what's going to happen. But do you think that's a good decision, a wise decision, because it's such a beloved in its circles? It's beloved.
First of all, it's very rare that directors direct their own sequel or prequel.
Right.
I worked with Minkoff on supposedly a Jetsons movie at Warner Brothers that was canceled, but he directed both Stuart Little's, and I think he was afraid of being typecast to be a director of animation live action combinations. But he came to the house, Rob Minkoff, a couple of times. The comment that I made to another email interview for a French magazine, I believe, and the same question was, do you think they should make a prequel or a sequel to Blade Runner? And my comment was, it would take a master to bring this off, because it's such an iconic, sealed together story, and the only trapdoor you have is when Rachel and Deckard go into the elevator, and the doors close. Now, Blade Runner had 5 beginnings. The release version was the 5th beginning. The first beginning was, I was in the meeting, Ridley and Michael Dealey were there, and John Rogers, and I don't know if Lawrence Paul was there or not. And no, Chuck Rosen, he was the first production designer, and he left, and then Lawrence Paul came in. And they had storyboards, and here's this long rampway down into a furnace. And the replicants that had been retired were going down to this furnace to be recycled, and Ridley said, you know, we can't really do that. That was beginning number one. Beginning number two, which I designed vehicles and costumes for, was on one of these off-world colonies. Had the big vehicle. We had the people running around in pressure suits, and that's where they were supposed to have killed the squad leader, hijacked the rocket ship to come to Earth. So that's number two. Number three was Deckard coming on a train from the east into Los Angeles, or San Angeles they called it, and they couldn't afford, funding was really limited on Blade Runner. They couldn't